Hi, everyone, and welcome to our very first episode of Cash Flow Conversations. This is a new video series that Home Healthcare News is launching. The goal is to give you all an inside look into our interviewing process while at the same time, hopefully providing some useful information that you can use back at your home health or home care agency. This is the perfect time to try something new, so that's what we're doing. Our first guest for Cash Flow Conversations is Matt Wolfe. He's a partner at law firm Parker Poe and somebody who's been an amazing source of information for HHCN lately. Matt, thanks for agreeing to do this.
My pleasure, Bob, and excited to be kicking off this series.
You're a real fearless pioneer being the first person that we have on here. Well, we're going to keep these episodes relatively short and only focus on a couple of key topics. There's simply too much to cover if we don't do that. Today, we're going to be talking about the first wave of emergency funding from CMS, along with maybe some new funding that's been out there, some do's and don'ts associated with that. And then separately, we're going to talk about CMS's accelerated and advanced payment program. Matt, to start, could you just recap what happened about 2 weeks ago now with that first tranche of 30 billion that CMS Administrator Seema Verma described as no strings attached?
Right. So about 2 hours into one of the now seemingly infamous White House briefings, CMS Administrator Seema Verma announced that $30 billion of the $100 billion that Congress had appropriated through the CARES Act to HHS to provide emergency relief to healthcare providers, that $30 billion was going to go out to all Medicare providers and suppliers, and that money was going to go out that week. I think the announcement was made on Tuesday or Wednesday, and the expectation was set during the briefing that it would come out that week. And for those of you that are Christian, it was Good Friday when the money actually started coming up. So people woke up in the morning, checked their bank accounts, and in some cases found a nice infusion of revenue entitled HHS payments that had come from Optum Bank. So that was that initial $30 billion of the $100 billion. Now, not all of it went out on April 10th. There was a few $1 billion that was delayed and was paid out the week after, which was April 17. Earlier this week, we're sitting here talking on April 24th. So just a couple of days ago, HHS announced its plans for some of the remaining $70 billion. And that includes an additional $20 billion that will be generally allocated in order so that everyone's share will be proportional to their 2018 net payment revenue. They're also planning on sending out $10 billion next week to hospitals in particular that have been adversely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. They're going to spend $400 million towards the Indian Health Service. They're going to put $10 billion for rural health clinics and rural hospitals, including government-owned rural hospitals. And then there's a remaining portion that is going to go to payment for COVID-related diagnosis and treatment for the uninsured. That amount is not yet known, but we do know that that because of a subsequent round of funding, that fund will be replenished with an additional $75 billion, some of which may be available to some of HHCN's readers and the participants on this video chat.
So as we're talking about, just throwing out tens of billions of dollars out there, all this is coming from the CARES Act, correct?
Well, the CARES Act was where the initial $100 billion came from, and then the $75 billion that was replenished, that was in tandem with the refueling of the payroll protection program that the Small Business Administration did. That was where the $75 billion came from.
Gotcha. And when let's say I'm a home health provider, I woke up on Good Friday with an extra $1 million in my bank account. That was part of this initial first tranche of funding. Are there any rules with how I could actually spend that money?
Right. So when it was announced at the White House briefing, Administrator Verma said that there were no strings attached, and generally that is true. That is, there are not specific ways in which they have to be spent, or at least not as specific or as cabin as some of the other available programs, particularly those that are being administered through the SBA. But if you receive these funds, you have 30 days to sign an attestation. And that attestation requires that you certify that you have not been terminated by Medicare, that your billing privileges have not been revoked, and that you have, since January 30th, treated a COVID-19 patient. Now, initially, a lot of folks thought that was going to be a real limit because they thought, well, I don't know whether I've treated a COVID-19 patient, or I'm not, primarily focused on doing that, especially if you think about other Medicare providers and suppliers like physician specialties, like or orthopedist, for example, that does surgeries. What HHS then clarified was that they interpreted a COVID-19 patient or a patient that possibly has COVID-19 to be very broad, to include essentially any patient. So if you provided any services, treatment, diagnosis, or care since January 30th, you are eligible to retain those funds. Now, one of the catches and one of the things that I know is causing some ongoing consternation among providers, and provider groups and individual providers are working with HHS to get some clarification about this, is what limitations they have on how they spend that money. So if you look at the CARES Act, it was very clear that it was designed to deal with the public health crisis and to put money towards the front line for hospitals that are dealing with COVID-19. But it was also designed to help provide some relief to healthcare providers who are suffering from the economic impact of this pandemic and the shelter-in-place and stay-at-home orders that have decreased utilization of healthcare services overall. So the terms and conditions are in writing, but there's still some additional clarification that is needed. Fortunately, providers do have 30 days. So what we've been encouraging folks to do is to not sign the attestation yet, to also not send the money back yet, to put that money into a segregated account. So that way you are able to account for how that money is spent down the road, and to ensure that money is going to make you whole for the losses that were sustained from the economic downturn caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, or to provide relief. So for example, for paying for additional PPE or something like that. It's also important to make sure you're separately accounting for those funds if you are taking advantage of any of the other programs that might be available to healthcare providers. So that way it doesn't appear down the road that you were double dipping in any way.
So just to recap, pieces of advice if I'm a home health provider. One, don't sign the attestation yet if I haven't. Wait until we can maybe get some clarity. Two, keep this pool of emergency funding separate from everything else. And then three, just generally keep very, very detailed financial notes on how and when I'm spending this money.
Right, and that's familiar advice to providers who are used to taking painstaking notes on everything they do in order to be able to justify it down the road. This infusion of revenue is different because it's not associated with any particular claim or any particular patient or even any particular service, but it is going to be important that you can account for it because earlier this week, HHS did announce that it was going to engage in some robust auditing after the fact to make sure that these funds were properly utilized.
All right, well, let's shift gears and talk about a different cash flow topic, and that's the expanded advanced and accelerated payment program from CMS. Let's just start out broadly. What is this program and what is it normally for?
Right. So this is an existing program. It was ordinarily for providing relief to providers in areas that have been hit by a natural disaster, for example, so hurricanes or tornadoes. That was how it was used before. Essentially, it allows Medicare providers to borrow from Medicare up to 3 months of their revenue. So for now, it's for the fourth quarter of 2019. And then depending on the provider type, so for hospitals, there's a longer repayment term. For other non-hospital providers, it's a shorter repayment term, but you're then obligated to repay it back starting at 120 days and have to complete repayment within 210 days. What CMS announced shortly after public health emergency was declared was that this accelerated advance payment program was going to be available nationwide to all Medicare providers.
All right, so to recap, the key word there is borrow. This isn't a loan forgiveness program. This is money that if you request it, you receive it, you're going to have to pay it back within 210 days.
Right, for non-hospital providers. It's also important to know that the repayments are going to be made by offset. So if you're continuing to bill Medicare, you're going to be paying it back, whether you want to or not. So those repayments will be made by offset to future Medicare payments. Yes, and again, to emphasize, it is not a grant, unlike the CARES Act funds that we were talking about before. It is a loan. There is no provision for any sort of forgiveness, unlike the payroll protection program that a lot of folks have been talking about and some have been pursuing. It is essentially an interest-free loan from Medicare for Medicare providers and suppliers.
Generally speaking, is there a situation when it might be right to pursue this kind of financial relief? What considerations should a provider make when thinking about requesting an accelerated payment?
Right. So obviously every provider situation is going to be a little bit different, but if you are anticipating that there's going to be a short-term impact to your revenue, but you expect that that revenue is going to catch up. So I think this is largely the case for home health providers, but of course we're dealing with an unprecedented situation. So we don't exactly know how utilization is going to return. We obviously all hope that it's going to build back up, and I think there's reason for public health purposes that we should want to see an increased utilization of home health. If you have uncertainty about whether your Medicare revenue is going to start to catch up to your sort of historical norms, then this may not be the right pot of money for you. You may want to look at some of the SBA programs if you're eligible. I know a lot of folks that are listening in may think, well, I have more than 500 employees, I'm not eligible. SBA also administers a Main Street lending program that has not garnered as much attention, but it's available to larger employers and does have some benefits in terms of a financing mechanism. And then, of course, obviously there are some loans available through lines of credit or through your financial institution as well.
All right, well, I think that's a good place to end this first episode of Cash Flow Conversations. Matt, thanks for the insight.
My pleasure, Bob. Thanks so much.
And thanks for everybody out there watching. Stay tuned as we continue to roll these out. The next one should be coming next week.
They will only get better from here.